Well, good morning, no, good afternoon to you all. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute here at the center. I thank you very much for having responded on this invitation on short notice. We couldn't have done it with much time before because the event we are talking about here today happened just a week ago. And we have more responses than the public here shows. We had 80 to 90 responses, and we hope that people will keep arriving. We are here to talk about the implications, the aftermath of the presidential impeachment in Brazil on the 31st. And I have the pleasure, and I'm very grateful to have with me and with us today six dear friends that have been really great collaborators to the Brazil Institute. João Augusto de Castro Neves, Director from Latin America, Director of Latin America at the Eurasia Group. Joel Velasco, Senior Vice President of Bright Stonebridge Group. Juliano Basile, Washington Correspondent for Valor Econômico. Kelly Mayman, Managing Partner of McClarty Associates. Mauricio Moura, Managing Director of Idea Inteligência. And Monica Baumgarten de Boll, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is also a professor at the SAIS, Johns Hopkins. Today, as you know, is Brazil's National Day, the day where in 1822 a Portuguese prince declared Brazil independent from Portugal at the margins, at the placid margins of a creek that is presented as a river. It was also a creek called Ipiranga. Ipi, river, Ranga, red. So you have your Tupi Guarani for the day. It is a very important, obviously, and sad event, what happened. An impeachment. Unfortunately, the second time we resort to this device, constitutional device, to end the presidency. Just to summarize, I wrote a piece that appeared yesterday in the Financial Times online, summarizing what I termed as the impeachment with impunity, and that is sort of the problem of the process. Monica also wrote something that appeared at the Peterson Institute website, and we have the copies available there for you, and they are also linked to the event's announcement. What happened is that at the very last moments of the impeachment ritual, the vote, something emerged that we know now had been orchestrated for some time behind the scenes, where the vote to impeach the president for what in the United States would be crimes and misdemeanors. In Brazil, it's crimes of responsibility. It is governed by Article 52 of the Brazilian Constitution. Article 52 states very clearly that if you found the members of the Senate, 81 members of the Senate, if 3/4 of them find the leader, 3/4 of them, 2/3 of them, I'm sorry, 2/3 of them, or 54 of 81, find the president guilty as charged, having committed crimes of responsibility, or in the United States, crimes and misdemeanor. In Brazil, the penalty is first removal from power and the loss of political rights or ineligibility for 8 years. It's clearly stated. It's this with that. But at the very last minute, the presiding officer of the impeachment process, who was the Chief Justice of Brazil, this is precisely like in the United States. the Chief Justice presides impeachment process in the Senate that meets as a court. He announced that he proposed that to split the vote between guilty or not guilty, and then the consequence. This was done. The president was removed by 61 votes, 20 against it. But when it came to the second vote, it did not reach the 54. Yeah, I think it was 42. And therefore, President Dilma Rousseff was removed from office, but she has maintained her eligibility. I don't know if it's important for her career. President Dilma Rousseff was never actually a politician in the traditional sense. She never ran for anything elective office until she ran for president of Brazil in 2010. But the fact is that this has consequences, and I write in this article my interpretation of this, and many people interpret this as a way that the political class or the senators found to maybe prepare some precedent that would help Brazilian politicians that are under investigation, under potential indictment for crimes of corruption. And we have a bunch of them in that condition. I believe that this is an unfortunate event in the way it was done. If you're going to say that the president is guilty of crimes and misdemeanors, you should apply the consequences. By not applying the consequences, actually, and here I wrote this, I think President Dilma has an argument. You didn't punish, or you didn't apply the punishment, so why did you remove her? And now, there has been now 10 appeals to the Supreme Court, so the case is not closed. The Supreme Court of Brazil, which, by the way, will change leadership on Monday. The Chief Justice that presided over this process, Ricardo Lewandowski, ends his term as Chief Justice this Sunday. This is what happens in Brazil. They rotate every 2 years on the basis of seniority as Chief Justice. And Minister Carmen Lúcia, one of the 2 women in Brazil's Supreme Court, will become a Chief Justice. And it's probably under her leadership that they will appreciate this. So they will discuss and decide what to do. There are, as I mentioned, 10 appeals. One of the appeals from President Dilma Rousseff's lawyers asking that the first vote, the one that found her guilty, be thrown out. And it has all argued on technical basis, okay? All appeals. And there are 8 that say, says more or less the same thing, which is they should strike out the second vote. Strike down the second vote. One of those was presented by the PSDB, formerly in opposition to President Dilma, now in support of President Temer, that became president 1 hour after President Dilma was removed from office. This appeal is supported by 3 other parties, including the party of President Temer, the PMDB, who is also the party of the president of the Senate in Brazil, Renan Calheiros, who clearly supported this splitting of the vote. So, will the Supreme Court rule over this? They may, but most likely they will not. They will let the decision stand. There are certain politicians that have already expressed their relief, because they think that if President Dilma could be found guilty but not lose her political rights, well, this probably should apply to them also. There is one, Delcídio Amaral, who was arrested as senator and expelled from Congress and lost his political rights in October last year for participating in a conspiracy, accused of participating in a conspiracy to water down, to compromise Lava Jato, the investigation on the Petrobras scandal, corruption scandal, has already been to the Supreme Court asking that his political rights be restored. And obviously this will continue. We don't know what are exactly the legal consequences, but most legal scholars are appalled by this. Some are not. Some say that this is okay. There is even in the literature an article written by now President Michel Temer, who is a constitutional professor of constitutional law. In the 90s, he wrote that it was perfectly okay to split the vote. The Dean of the Supreme Court of Brazil, Celso de Mello, who is normally a very cautious judge, who doesn't speak publicly very much, gave 2 interviews last week, one to Globo newspaper, the other for Globo Television, the network, in open air, the largest in Brazil, basically to explain that this was not possible, that this is clearly unconstitutional. Another member of the Supreme Court, also one of the senior members, Gilmar Mendes, said that he found it bizarre, to be polite, his words, and that this decision would not pass a kindergarten level exam of constitutional law. Here we go. Changing this is complicated, and so I will stop here, and I will ask our friends to talk about this and the consequences of this, the implications, etc. And I would like, just the order, I will ask João Augusto to start, because he is what, in Portuguese, there was an old television program that talked about the testemunha ocular da história, which he was there. He was there the day it happened. He was in the Senate. He saw the whole thing. So I will ask João to give us his notion of what happened, what could happen. Then we have Juliano Basile, who for 18 years covered the Supreme Court of Brazil. So he covered the Supreme Court of Brazil by actually more time than most serving members of the Supreme Court have been there. So he knows, he could give a little guidance to some of them, the more recently arrivals. Then I will ask Monica de Boll and Mauricio to reflect a little bit about the implications, the economic implications, because this may have complicated President Temer's main task, which is to find a manner to stop the longest and deepest recession Brazil has ever encountered and reverse, because that is the basis and the only basis in which I think he can gain popularity, legitimacy, and keep going. And then after Mauricio and Monica, I will ask Kelly Myman and Joel Velasco, who work in the private sector in advising companies, etc., that are investors in Brazil, to give us how is this read in the private sector. It is important because the attitude of investors will be key to this, to the outcome of this. Will companies invest in Brazil? There are opportunities. The president was just after assuming office, he went to China and listed and offered opportunities to invest in Brazil to the amount of it's 260 billion in ports, airports, and infrastructure, everything that you probably know we need in Brazil. Not the first time, because President Lula did the same, President Dilma did the same. Now, the question is, would companies invest in a country where the Senate can basically change the Constitution using a procedural device? What is the legal security offered to investors? I think those are questions that With that, João, how do you saw it? You were there, you saw it, and you saw the emotions, you saw the maneuvers, and you know about the stuff. So I will give them 7 minutes in the first round, and then we will continue and open to your questions.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure, and it's an honor to be here with a very distinguished panel of Brazil experts. I would say that, to add to your vocabulary of Tupi-Guarani, I would add jabuticaba. Jabuticaba is a Brazilian berry that it's typical to Brazil, and usually we use it to refer to an event that is peculiar to Brazil, if not baffling as well to some outsiders. And what happened last week, I think, would be an example. Would be appropriate to call it jabuticaba, legal, political jabuticaba, which means that what the Senate did, dividing, as Paulo made an allusion to, divide the impeachment vote, was quite creative. I left Brasilia a little bit more baffled and confused than when I was there. But looking at the bigger picture, right, and looking at the next few months in Brazil, I would flag that there are 3 key political risks that will greatly be in the way of the new term administration, and also how investors may also perceive Brazil as a possible a target for new investments and new projects. I think that the first risk was the obvious ones, the more immediate risk of the Supreme Court potentially overruling or not the impeachment vote that happened last week. I think Juliano would definitely be much more knowledgeable here to talk about the details of the Supreme Court. But I think that if you look at, what the Senate did was it created this shadow of doubt that the impeachment, which was already being questioned, the legal grounds for an impeachment, violation of fiscal responsibility law, to many were not seen as a very robust evidence for that would be considered a high crime or misdemeanor by President Rousseff. But now with cushioning the attempt to cushion her fall by keeping her political rights, was seen as a kind of a potentially an evidence or an indication that she was innocent to start with. What can happen in the Senate? I think in the Supreme Court now. I think in the next week or two, the Supreme Court is likely to make a decision on all these challenges, all these appeals that were there. I think there are 3 main possibilities there. One, they just ignore and decide not to get into the merit of the decision. That's the Senate's responsibility, which from a market perspective, from an investor perspective, would be wonderful. It's maintained the status quo. The second possibility would be to we have a legal jabuticaba, which would mean they interpret what the Senate did and decide to annul one of the votes and not the other. Although that could be problematic as well, because the legal experts say that if you annul one, you automatically are tainting the entire session. And the third possibility would be annul the whole thing, ask the Senate to do it again. If from a market perspective, that's the worst one, because it would create some uncertainties. Market are fixated with some very small things sometimes. But even if that were to happen again, we would still think that the Senate would confirm the impeachment. It would just take a little bit longer. It wouldn't be as removing a Band-Aid. It would be a little bit longer than that. 13 years in power, I think there's some glue left to remove everything at once. So what does that mean from a legal perspective? I think that I think that this will be resolved relatively quickly. From a political perspective, this whole creative process maneuvering that happened in the Senate did highlight some of the fissures within the governing coalition between the PMDB and the PSDB. I don't think it, even though the initial reactions from the PSDB, the main ally of the government, were pretty intense, and they were very frustrated with the whole thing. I don't think this aggravates even more. I think from the start, our view has been, it was one in which the coalition, even though there's a great overlap, great convergence of views in terms of reforms that need to be done, we don't think that, we don't think it's going to be easy sailing, right? So I think what happened last week is one sign of this. We'll have more going forward. I don't think it makes sense for the PSDB to leave the government, because the PSDB is in a very tough spot. If you look what the PSDB's primary goal is to win the 2018 election, I think it's better to be in a supporting role in government than to be in a supporting role in the opposition, right? If the PSDB were to leave the opposition, it wouldn't be the main opposition to the government, and they would have a hard time finding a straight message, especially because they do agree with a lot of the reforms that are being presented by the government. So from a political perspective, there will be a fallout, but I think will also be limited. I mean, not trying to paint a rosy picture here, but I do think that it doesn't aggravate the problem. It just confirms, validates that we have we have a very heterogeneous coalition to begin with. The second risk is something that's happening today and happened last Sunday. Is protests, right? I think we are in a very protest-prone environment in Brazil. If you look at, since 2013, right, you have this whole middle-class discontent narrative in Brazil, among other emerging markets as well, even here in the U.S., some might say, right, with the rise of the extremes here in the U.S. as well. But in Brazil, we have this discontent with the entire political class, which definitely shows how hard it is to govern. You have a moment, at least a period of weaker leaders. Low approval ratings, and not only in Brazil. Look at the rest of the region, right? Bachelet or Pinha Neto, now a problem with, I don't Trump's visit was benefit to Trump, so that was a problem there. So this means that weaker leaders, they tend to have a harder time implementing their policy agenda. And this is here to stay for a while. And the protests highlight that and highlight the kind of difficulties Temer will face in implementing a very unpopular measure. The comparison with Itamar Franco in 93, 94 is interesting because there are many similarities, right? The VP taking over and transitioning. But the problem is that the success of the Itamar government, meaning the Real Plan, stabilization plan, generated immediate popularity, which gave the conditions so the success of Minister of Finance Fernando Cardoso back then generated instant popularity to the candidate Fernando Cardoso. This time around is the other way around, right? The success of the economic policy in the short term now does not generate popularity in the short term. So protests, we're concerned with that. I think that strikes will be a pretty serious thing. Going forward, could cause disruptions. And the third and final one is one that I cannot talk in 30 seconds. Is Lava Jato, is the corruption scandal. But just to flag that we are into a new normal in Brazilian politics now, in the sense of investigations, a very autonomous judiciary and prosecutors that you have, and this is a new normal. So we may have we're definitely going to have offshoots of Lava Jato. So for the corporate world, investors alike, and the political class, this is definitely a risk is here to stay, and will also constrain the maneuvering room for the government the next 2 years.
Okay, thank you. You are familiar with Lava Jato if you have been coming here. We had on July 14th, Judge Sergio Moro was sitting exactly where I am sitting right now and explained that. And actually, on November 7th, we will have two members of the Supreme Court, Minister Gilmar Mendes and Minister Teori Savasky, at this table, talking about all of this. So plenty of opportunity, and I hope to have also Minister Carmen Lucia here relatively soon. Juliano, what will the Supreme Court do with the 10 appeals? If you could, this, the judges, the justices, regarding the three options that João outlined.
Well, I think that João said well. I think that the Supreme Justice, they have these three options to decide it. It's very difficult to see what they are going to do. At the time of the Senate decision, last August 31st, my thought was that the Supreme Court was not going to interfere. So that is the first option. Because every time the Supreme Court interfere in the subject of the Senate, they know that they will be criticized for that. So this is the first option for them, is to not interfere. But then I get a second thought, and I remember that I was talking to Paulo about that. And my second thought is that by the time that I saw what Lewandowski did, and he was my professor, so I really remember the guy, and Lewandowski is very gentle, so I remember, and I was remembering, My first day in law school, Lewandowski was there, and he was criticizing people that were cutting our hair. So, so he knows how to please you, and he's a very gentle guy. But at that time, I was really disappointed by my old professor, if I may say, because if you read the Article 52 of the Constitution, it's just pretty clear that once you convict the president to lose her job, once the Senate convict the president to lose her job, you have the inhabilitation for any public position during 8 years. So the Constitution uses the expression with. It's not maybe she will be inhabilitated. It's with the inhabilitation. So it's like Celso de Mello said, it's something that you cannot split. You cannot separate it.
Unitarian structure.
Sure. So it's very simple. It's something that you don't have to discuss. And they put this thing to the Supreme Court to discuss again, and it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it's something that you cannot separate. And then I get a third thought, and I was thinking about that also. And my third thought was, why is so difficult in Brazil to punish politicians? So I covered the Supreme Court for 18 years. I started my work there in 1997, and I saw for the first time a politician being charged and guilty in 2010. So I stayed there for, you can make the count, it was 13 years to see for the first time a politician being convicted. And I was remembering the great trial, the Mensalão trial. So our Supreme Court, our justice, they had to stay for 53 sessions to convict 24 people. And 15 of these sessions was dedicated only to one particular phase of the trial that they called the dosimetry, was dedicated to the graduation of the fines, to the justice to decide how many years they were going to stay in jail. And after that, we had also another phase, which was the embargoes phase, the appeals phase. And we had 16 sessions. So they stay for 69 sessions to convict 24 people. It's almost 3 sessions of our Supreme Court for each person. And then they change everything. During the phase of the embargoes, they change not everything, but many things. For example, José Dirceu, who was the leader of Mensalão, he was convicted during the trial for 10 years and 10 months, and then they reduce his time in jail for 7 years and 11 months. And in our criminal law in Brazil, we know that if you stay between 4 and 8 years, you are going to stay in a regime that we call semi-aberto, which is you can go to work by the day and you return to prison during the night. So Dirceu was, during the embargoes phase, he stayed precisely in the border of the line to get this regime, this semi-aberto regime. And what is most amazing about this very difficult thought that how is difficult to punish in Brazil is that Dirceu received a fine of almost 1 million reais at that time, and people paid for his fine. So he opened a website in the internet, and 4,000 people, they paid for his fine. This is really amazing.
Julian, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If is there any price to be paid by the Supreme Court? Because the Supreme Court and the judiciary in Brazil in general have acquired a lot of sympathy. I think of the 3 powers of the Republic, is the only one that people see with respect and consideration today in Brazil. I think I'm not exaggerating. Is there the Supreme Court doesn't run any risk, especially under the leadership of Ministra Carmen Lucia, to lose credibility in the decision that they will make, whatever that decision may be?
I think that is a question that they are going to face it. And I think that they are already discussing this. If I know the Supreme Court members, I think that they are talking among each others. They are going to want to the apartment of they live in the same block in Brazil, in the same apartment building in Brazil. So I think that they are already discussing this because in the recent years, Mensalão, we can criticize everything about Mensalão, but it was also a hope for us because finally people people received punishment for their crimes. And then we have car wash operation, we have Lava Jato operation, and we have the scandal of the corruption of Petrobras. And it is the talk of the country, not also the talk of the town, it's the talk of the country for the last 2 years in Brazil. And Dilma Rousseff was chairman of the board of Petrobras.
Mm-hmm.
So they start to investigate the company, and they start to investigate her as well. And it's amazing. This is really amazing in the impeachment process, how the Senate produced more than 22,000 pages during the impeachment process, and Dilma Rousseff was not even investigated during the impeachment process for what happened in Petrobras. Come on, she was chairman of the board for many years. So yeah.
Let me go. Can I come back?
Sure,
to you?
sure,
Because
sure.
I would like to go quickly to all four. Now, just one thing. You're thinking today, what will the Supreme Court go? Sit on it and let it pass? The Supreme Court will decide to the second vote, will not, because if the Supreme Court can decide whatever they want, there is no
Yeah, they can
recourse.
cancel the second vote, as João said.
They can cancel the whole
They
thing.
can just not interfere. They
What-
can interfere in all the process. But you know that this can get worse if they interfere in the whole process and if they say to the Senate, you must do everything again. So what is going to happen? We don't know, because car wash operation is just going. So maybe the people of Odebrecht, they are signed the plea bargain.
Yeah.
So maybe we are going to have some news, and Renan Calheiros is going to be put under pressure again. So we don't know how it will be in the Senate.
And remember, November 12th is the deadline. The process of impeachment has to be
because they have
concluded.
180 days to vote the process.
If they don't, Dilma...
Just to be
becomes
accurate,
president.
she comes back.
She comes
yeah,
back.
that-
Okay, so...
So
with that-
imagine that. Yeah, we don't know who is going to be the
with
president
that-
of Brazil anymore.
Let me invite Monica with that thought. Let me invite Monica to give you how this thing has been perceived. You wrote about this. So.
Yeah. I'm not going to comment on your last thought, though. The Dilma
you
comeback
cannot.
thought. I'm not commenting on that one.
It's a free country, a free center. Comment.
Let's assume she's not coming back for
Okay.
the moment. So I'll make my comments on a much easier topic, which is, the economic outlook. So much more simple than the political one, and so dissociated from the political one as well, right? At least that's how markets have been behaving in Brazil right now. There was a logic, I think, and this I touch upon that on the piece that Paulo was mentioning that is outside for anyone who wants to read it. There was a very clear rationale for the market rally that we've seen since the beginning of the year. So we've seen stock markets in Brazil go up by more than 60% between February and now. And the logic or the rationale behind it is that what markets were really seeing was the country going from a situation where there was no leadership, there was no clear lack of direction on economic policies, to a possible different scenario or alternative scenario where there would be a new government with more political clout, with greater ability to negotiate with Congress, and hence pass the necessary reforms that everybody was looking to. So this is the main explanation for the market rally. Now, this, of course, brings a question mark as to how things should proceed from here on. Because, of course, even though economists do suffer, and I'm an economist, and sometimes I do suffer from this myself, economists do have a tendency to suffer from dissociative disorders. At the end of the day, we can't exactly dissociate the political outlook from the economic one. And there were 3 words that were mentioned here by João when he was talking. And these words were fractured base, protests, and Lava Jato. These and Jabuticaba. But I have my own term for the impeachment process that happened in Brazil. Brazil has, as we all know, a presidentialist system that we called presidentialism, coalition presidentialism. And what we saw last week was coalition impeachment, because there was an actual agreement between the various parties to split the vote. So we know that now with the benefit of hindsight. But in any event, the fractures, Lava Jato, the protests, the fact that the split vote creates a new type of judicial uncertainty, if we can put it that way. All these things bring renewed uncertainty into the economic outlook and into the prospect of passing very tough reforms through Congress. João was speaking about Itamar versus Temer, which I think is, and he made a point which I think is crucial. The point being that while the Itamar administration may superficially look like what's happening now, given that there was a president impeached and the vice president taking over, the key difference is exactly the one he pointed to. At that time, you had a positive reform agenda, a reform agenda that by bringing inflation down was actually one of the largest or the most effective means of bringing people out of poverty that we have seen in Brazil. Leaving aside, of course, the social programs. Because as you bring inflation down, especially from 4 digits to 1 digit, you're basically removing a massive regressive tax from people. And you actually do improve people's prospects and people's incomes. So you had that reform effort taking place in the mid-1990s, whereas now you have a proposed reform effort that, yes, will help to put the country on a sounder footing in the medium to long term, but in the short term, it takes away benefits. So when we speak of Social Security reform, we're speaking of taking away benefits. When we speak of expenditure caps, which is the other big reform effort that Temer and Meirelles have both been proposing, that also removes benefits. That also reduces possibly spending on education, spending on health, and a number of other things that do directly affect people's incomes, but not in the positive way that a reduction in inflation back in the 90s did, but in a negative way in the first instance. Yes, all of these things will have, if they pass in the way that they were originally proposed, which is a very big if, they will have very good implications for the medium to long term. But in the short term, they create a lot of tension in a system that is already tense. So in other words, these are reforms that would have been hard to pass under any scenario, let alone a scenario where you have a president whose legitimacy has been questioned and is being questioned, who has become president under a process whose legitimacy is also being questioned because there are questions about whether this was a constitutional, whether the Constitution was heard or not. And in essence, we're looking at a case where the real prospect for these reforms is looking rather grim, to say the least. And if they do pass, they will probably pass with significant dilution. So that leaves open the question of what we can actually expect in the next 2 years. And I dare say that I can't be too optimistic. I've used the term, being cautiously optimistic. I myself don't really know what that means. But to put it bluntly, it's very difficult to see how Brazil is going to grow at the pace that some market participants seemed to believe a few weeks ago. So there were many thinking that perhaps in 2017, Brazil could grow as much as 2%. Yes, Brazil is coming from a very, very low base, so it's not that that's an impossibility. However, given the level of dysfunction that we still see in the political system, given the challenges that this government is going to face in passing these reforms through, given the way that markets have been behaving towards these reforms that perhaps might not actually take place, there is significant doubt here. And there's reason to expect a much more subdued growth going forward. There are a few silver linings, and I'll end there. And the silver linings that we have on the economic front come from the privatization program that the government is proposing to implement, although that itself is linked to the reform effort. So how much, investor interest you can actually galvanize from a privatization program does depend a lot on investors' expectations as to what the country's prospects in the future will be. But there is a concerted effort into putting together a meaningful privatization program. The judicial uncertainty issue, of course, also throws a bit of a wrench into this. But having said that, there is that. And the second thing and last thing that I will say is that interest rates in Brazil, which have remained very high and which the central bank is still keeping very high, it's true that inflation is still relatively high in Brazil, but it has been coming down, and the central bank does have room to lower them if push comes to shove. So in other words, there is some room for monetary policy to be a bit more audacious than it has been, and for interest rates to come down, and that would help a bit households, the corporate sector, and the government. And I can come back to that point later.
Okay, thank you very much, Mauricio. In a bit more than 1 month, we are going to go back to the polls. Municipal elections all over Brazil, 5,650 plus cities. What is the impact of this in that process?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Paulo, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody. I have some. I'm gonna do as the Senate does. I'm gonna split my talk here, and I'm gonna start saying that President Temer is and will be an unpopular president. We have all numbers as of today saying that his popularity is in a very low number at the moment. Just to give you the last poll that we have, only 10% of Brazilians said that he is a very good or a good president. 50% of Brazilians were saying that's going to be or a bad or a very bad president as of today. They had another poll in the 27 capitals of Brazil. Every single capital, people think that he's a bad president as of today. I ran a survey last week, and one of the results was that 55% do not think that Brazil will be better off with Temer as a president. So it's the majority of the population now saying that we're not going to be better off having Temer as a president. But on the other hand, 45% think that the economy will be better under President Temer compared to Dilma. I don't know if this is a good comparison. I also asked if people thought that the impeachment process was a coup, and 77% think that was not a coup. Only 12% think was a coup at all. I did a telephone survey 2 days ago, and 65% do not know what happened in the Senate. They didn't know the vote was split. So 65% do not know what happened. Maybe João that was there, no one know what happened there. And I'm happy that now the Senate is producing jabuticaba. I thought they used to produce a lot of pineapples. I'm happy they're diversifying the production.
Yeah, abacaxi in Portuguese is one, is a metaphor for problem. When you have an abacaxi, is
and those
problem.
For those 30% do not support the voting split, and 5% agreed with the voting split and think Dilma should keep their electability and their rights. And so, first of all, Temer is not going to.
5% agreed that she should have.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, first of all, it's going to be very hard for him to gain popularity, especially because what Monica said, the economics and the dynamics of the reforms and everything together is going to be very tough on him. Now, having said that, one of the, in terms of the municipal elections, the first thing that happened that we already see the fall of PT. Just to give you a number, in 2012, PT had 2,500 candidates for mayor in Brazil. This year, he had 1,000 less candidates for mayor compared to 2012. So they need to run. And as of today, PT is leading. They have in 220 cities, PT is running with no coalition. Basically, they are running by themselves. So the first impact is that the PT is going to be a much it's going to lose ground in terms of number of cities that they run. That's absolutely certain. There is a very likelihood that they're going to lose São Paulo as the capital of Brazil and the biggest budget in terms of capital cities in Brazil. So there is this impact that's already playing in that political scenario. One thing that I want to mention, and everybody's asking me about the potential presidential election in 2 years. And first of all the voters are looking for an alternative, and they don't see an alternative at all. So, and I have seen 3 factors that are going to play out on 2018 for the public opinion side. First of all is the economy, if any economic recovery will be there. If there is any economic hope, there is a chance that a PMDB candidate would gain from that. Could be a re-election of the President Temer. I don't see this as a very likely scenario. For the popularity, for the Temer itself, for the PMDB itself. But anyway, I'm seeing more and more in the local elections, the PMDB alongside with PSDB. I was listening to João talking about PSDB, and I asked myself which PSDB he's talking about. Because, for example, there's a lot of cities that PMDB is side by side with PSDB, officially and not officially. I'm going to give the example of São Paulo. In São Paulo, the PSDB is split. They have their own candidate from the governor. It's a TV show. I don't know how to qualify him, but it's an entrepreneur, a TV show guy that's running, is the governor candidate. And the PSDB of Serra is supporting Marta Suplicy, that used to be at PT. Now she is in that PMDB. And they are playing that in different places as well, in Ceará as well. So I see there's a good chance that Serra moves to PMDB in a very short term. Yeah, so
let's not confuse people, because political parties in Brazil are like a cab that you take to go to power. There are many.
Which PSDB are going to be in the opposition? Which PSDB is going to be in the government? That's the question. And the second. And the second thing that people are asking, so the second political or second point for presidential elections is the Lava Jato itself, and then there's a black box. Everybody supports the Lava Jato. So the support of Lava Jato runs above 90% of the Brazilian population. So there's a huge support of Lava Jato, and that's very constant. Everybody. And the third one that I see in terms of presidential elections, and as of today, the political campaigns at the municipal levels are in a very tough situation. Nobody has funds, nobody has money to work on the campaigns, and that's going to be very unlikely that they keep that way for a presidential campaign. And if as of today, it's going to be an open field, because there is no fund for political campaigns, because no private companies can donate anymore. So those 3 factors, the economy, I think, is the first one, the Lava Jato, and the political funding are going to play for the next presidential election.
Thank you very much. That may be a solution. No money for a presidential election.
Yeah.
That could be. Think about it.
Could work.
Money, no candidates.
Kelly. E agora?
Okay.
So a client of your company comes and they want to invest in Brazil. They are in Brazil, etc., and say, Kelly, what should I do?
Well, if they've been a longtime client of mine, they've heard me say many, many times that Brazil is a market for the long term. It is not a market for the short term. And what I would say is that, everything you've heard everyone present here represents a lot of turbulence. And if there's one thing that investors do not like, it's turbulence. They want stability. And the big question is, for those of you that watch Brazilian TV, Brazilian telenovelas last for a certain number of months. And for anyone here in the States, you know that ours last for decades. So our prayer is that this novella is a Brazilian novella and not a U.S. novella. In other words, that this can resolve itself, in the relatively near term. Not that investors want anything of the Lava Jato to be swept under the rug. This is viewed as a huge positive that Brazil is really confronting these issues. But by the same token, the level of uncertainty that you've heard just laid out here today is stark. And just the fact that, we do have the split vote. We do have this other shoe hanging with respect to how the Supreme Court is going to handle it. We've got multiple shoes hanging with the October expected testimony of Marcelo Odebrecht and others from Odebrecht with respect to the Lava Jato investigation. What are they going to say? Who are they going to implicate? Very open questions, all things to watch. But I do think that even in that environment and with the structural issues that Monica laid out being extremely challenging, there are things that this government definitely can do in order to send some positive signals even in that environment. They aren't terribly sexy things, but I do think that they can at least show that there is a willingness and an interest to, among a complicated environment, to try to interface and interact with investors. And again, not the markets. The markets perplex me too, Monica, to be totally honest. I don't work in the markets. I work with people that actually make stuff and sell stuff and provide services. Those guys would love to see some signals. They would love to see the infrastructure program, and yes, it's 3.0 at this point, as you said, Paolo. The many iterations of infrastructure programs. This one's going to be a tougher one because it's going to be harder to finance. But if you can structure the infrastructure program in a way that companies actually can make some money and take advantage of some of the openings that are there right now with respect to the Odebrechts and some of these other big players not being able to play in the way that they used to, does that provide some economic opportunity? When and if the government decides to do a cabinet reshuffle, how does that happen? Which positions are moved? Are there business-friendly players that are put into places like the Commerce Ministry? What does that look like? What does Morales, the finance minister's path, look like? Monica highlighted a couple of the reforms, pension and spending caps that are on his agenda. While not as purely technocratic as former finance minister Joaquin Levy, Morales is still not the most politicized guy in the cabinet. Who's going to get that stuff through Congress? That's a very open question. And what's the path going to be there? Are there things that the government can do on the margins with respect to regulatory reforms? God knows there's a lot that can be done in that space. I see Cassia Carvalho here from the U.S. Brazil Business Council. It's something that she as executive director works on a lot, is kind of what can be done on the margins of the regulatory realm to make the investment environment better. And then lastly, as a former USTR guy, I have to say the trade environment. And certainly this is something that Temer, that Serra as foreign minister, with responsibility obviously also for trade, especially now that they have both COMEX and APEX, so consolidating more power over trade relations. They have all indicated a willingness to be a bit more open, to try to rationalize and kind of get back on the right track Mercosur. And you have that all happening in an environment where CNI, which is the Brazilian Confederation of Industry, also is being a bit more open. So where do those paths lead? So, I would say, Paolo, those are all the factors I would argue that we need to be watching as investors in Brazil. We need to continue to engage despite all the tumult to see what can actually be achieved in this environment. Because there is, I would say that, the positive point is there is a willingness to engage. There is a recognition that this situation is really tough. And so, there is an openness, I would say, to at least discussing some of these issues and how you can make the investment climate a bit better.
Kelly, thank you very much. Just one reminder, talking about precisely the attitude of the new government. in terms of investment, open or not open the economy. On the 13th of this month in the morning at 10:30, the new Brazilian ambassador to the United States, Sergio Amaral, very close to Minister José Serra, will be here with a conversation about this process, from the government perspective. With that, I would like to ask Joel to give us his perspective on basically the same question. What should investors and people that are operating really already in Brazil, how do they see this, and what advice are you guys giving them?
Well, first, I think I'm going to try to be very brief here because I want to get to questions, and I think some of us are going to try to get drinks later, so I want to make sure we've got ample time for that. First thing, as Kelly pointed out, not only is Brazil not a place you can do business in the short term or think in the short term, it's also, when we're talking about business here, we are not talking about markets, and there's no real correlate. Stock market can be doing great, bond market can be doing great, but that doesn't mean really that the economy is necessarily doing well. And so we just, and the Brazilian press often kind of confuse, oh, look at this, numbers are great. Well, that doesn't quite mean much.
Always the fault of journalists.
Correct. Yeah, the media in general. But so let's just, for definition purposes, when we're talking here, we're talking about real business activity, the people that make stuff, deliver things. There are a lot of reasons, businesses are they go to where there's less resistance, and it's climate last year's, the news cycle has not helped. I mean, if you're the CEO of any company and some guy in your office, barely know where Brazil is, and they come in and says, I want to invest or need to do something. Like, isn't that where I just heard the place is turning into a banana republic? Or that kind of discussion, even if it's superficial, has a huge impact. And so I think Brazil has lost a lot of time in this, a lot of credibility, and it's going to, it's not just this government, it's going to be several governments to try to recover that. And there are a lot of storms out in the horizon. We've talked about the split vote, which my contribution to the fruit analogy is, I think, the Senate pisou na jaca, right? For those of you who are Brazilian, try to translate that
you
one.
Step on the jackfruit, which is really bad.
Sort of step.
You know
on
what a
something else.
jackfruit is, right? It's a very bad. It sticks to you.
We've got this brewing pension scandal in Brazil. State-owned companies' pension money was clearly misspent, and that's going to have a huge impact. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. And we haven't talked about here, but there's supposedly another vote next week to get rid of Eduardo Cunha.
Sure.
Yeah, we will have a special event.
Talk about, we haven't talked about pizza, but if that one ends up in a nice pizza, we're going to have real pineapple.
Okay, pizza, for those of you, pizza. Yeah, it is served somewhere in São Paulo, but pizza was something, it was a metaphor for, you have all those problems, you have all the investigation, and then it ends in pizza, meaning we go out for a pizza, forget about it. With the mensalão, it ended because everybody thought.
I'm deducting that from my time.
Yeah.
But what I really want to point out,
Oops.
that there's a lot of reason to have optimism, actually, in this whole thing. I think we've talked about the reforms that are at least being talked about. If you believe the government today, they're going to send a pension bill before the municipal elections. Doubt it will get much traction in the beginning, but that's a good sign. They're going to put some. I think the spending cap is a good one to have. It may be a great legacy of Brazil that we don't grow government spending beyond inflation. That would be a good thing. And I think there's a lot of opportunities being created from this crisis. I mean, you're hearing about a lot of M&A activity, or some people would say bottom fishing. But you know what? At some point, this is just good old economics, right? The asset prices are going down. I think the biggest one, and Kelly talked a little bit about the privatization. I think that's one of the greatest legacies we can have. Not because we need more privatization in Brazil per se, or that the state-owned government pensions are going to implode and we're going to have to figure out what to do with some of these assets, but it actually is going to, I believe and I hope, that there will be a discussion about the role of the state in Brazil. How big does the Brazilian government need to be? This country cannot survive if it continues to grow. And every politician, whether they belong to a PMDB or PSDB or whoever it may be, they think the solution, and like Kelly, I'm a good Democrat, that they think the solution lies in the government. And in Brazil, we've kind of taken this to an extreme, that everything needs to come from the government. And the government of Brazil cannot be the end-all, be-all for the place. And I think, through these crises, we're going to see, and we've talked about this before, Petrobras is a systemic risk to the economy of Brazil, and it's showing this crisis. And what we need to do is start reducing that role over time. Will that send good signals? I think it will. Will it make Temer's legacy be great? Probably not, but I don't think Temer is really looking for that. I think he recognizes the role he's going to play in Brazilian history. And I think, and I would even say external things like, the fact that TPP may stall here in the U.S. creates an opportunity for Brazil. Now Brazil can come back to the table and say, hey, we'd like to be part of another trade agreement if it wants to. But at the end of the day, I think the best thing that can happen for business in Brazil is the government knows where its role begins and ends, and we start respecting law. In the U.S., and I'll close just with this, in the U.S., we always talk about this as a common law country. I think after the impeachment, what we're seeing is Brazil's not a civil law, or it's really an uncommon law, because what's written in the Constitution doesn't necessarily always mean that. And that's fine. We just now know what the rules of the game. Everything is changeable, including the Constitution.
Yes, we are an
It
opportunity.
depends what the word.
An
with.
opportunity creating country. It's we are always creating. If you take crisis as opportunity, but let me go to you and ask some weird, and then we come back here. Questions? Any questions? No questions. Yes.
Why did you
Giuliano,
step on the jackfruit?
Well,
your
we-
professor.
yeah, we have some news today that they were doing an agreement in Brazil, and we have many reasons to believe that car wash operation is behind this agreement, because there are many senators, like the president of the Senate, Renan Calheiros. He is under formal investigation, so he's trying to find some way to get rid of it, and so we know by now that former President Lula was in Brazil at that time, and they met, and President Lula is also under investigation. So they try to create this new thing, which is
Wait, who met?
Lula and Renan Calheiros. Yeah, we just have this news that they are running like today and yesterday, explaining to us what happened in the previous days. So, as we know, some senators, they went to Lewandowski like two weeks ago or 15 days ago to explain to him that they want to split the process, the final vote. And first of all, as we know by this news, Lewandowski said to them that this was impossible. Then Lewandowski asked to his staff, to his team, and this is all things that I read it from Brazilian press, from my colleagues from Brazilian press. And his team said that this was impossible. And so what he did, he said to the Senate that the Senate was able to decide if the majority of the Senate wants to split or not. And they decided to split. So they create something new. First question was, do you think that Dilma is guilty? And the majority said yes. Do you think that she's going to receive a punishment? And people said no. So this is, this is kind of outrageous. It's very difficult. And now the Supreme Court has to decide, and I think that they are going to decide all these appeals. I think we can call this appeals, the 10 petitions. And I think that the majority of the Supreme Court, they are going to be very clear, and they are going to say that it's impossible to split. But I don't know what should be the next step of the Supreme Court, because once you declare that you cannot split, then you must decide, so now what are you going to do? Are you going to cancel all the final vote? Are you going to cancel only the second part of the vote? Or are you going to leave it as they decided? So that's it.
If they say that you cannot split, but this time it's okay. I don't think that will fly. But with the public, especially if the public concludes that it was done to undermine Lava Jato, that has 90% approval. That's why my question about credibility of the Supreme Court, because the executive and the parliamentary, the legislative, don't have much of that left. So, questions, please. No questions. Yes, one question.
Question perhaps for Mr. Velasco. The discussion of possible privatization steps that could be taken, how might those be applied to Petrobras? Is there any discussion underway to, like was done in Mexico, to allow greater foreign investment in a company that was famously a protectionist?
Yeah, they're already doing a couple of things, right? So they're in the process of changing the rules. This requires legal changes. Actually, as Paulo was saying here, Foreign Minister Zé Serra is the author of this bill to basically allow to take away the requirement in the pre-salt projects for Petrobras to have to be the majority. So that's one change they can do. Will attract, of course, at current oil prices. Not a lot of people are going to go for the pre-salt. The pre-salt may belong to Brazil, and it may belong forever because it's going to stay down there. The other thing is Petrobras is shedding off assets, right? And that's the other kind of, still sort of trimming around the edges, right? But they're trying to sell the fuel distribution business.
Pipelines.
Yeah, they're going to
gas pipelines.
But the fundamental thing that they're still not doing, and I think this is just because it's radioactive in Brazil still, is the concept of just saying, all right, let's split the business. Let's create more than one oil company and do, Petrobras is really sort of the analogy, I think, to me, is sort of Standard Oil in the U.S. I mean, it doesn't work, or a Mabel. It just needs to be broken up because it's too big to manage at this point. And so is that reasonable to expect to be done at this point? No, I don't think so. But I think they can trim around the edges. They can do some of the things. And let's remember, they've got somebody who is quite competent at Petrobras now, a true civil servant, Pedro Parente, the new CEO. And I think if you notice, he's not making splash. He's not making news. He's there every day working, trying to solve some of these problems. How much slack will the public prosecutor, or will the you've seen some of these issues with public prosecutors not accepting the plea bargain agreements. How hard are they going to be on Petrobras? They may just sink Petrobras before it's too long. That's one of the fears I have.
The other issue, if I can add quick, Paulo, is that they're looking at is addressing the rather heavy-handed local content requirements in the oil and gas sector. This is something that crosses many, many sectors in Brazil, and that frankly has origins in 1950s industrial policy, primarily in that era in the auto sector, but it permeates at this point virtually all sectors. And just as a side note, there is a case at the WTO that Brazil is most likely to lose over the course of the next 3 months that also addresses local content requirements in the auto sector and the IT sector. So the convergence of losing that case when you have a foreign ministry that is responsible for complying with the WTO, I suspect, will be very responsible about compliance with that award. At the same time that you're trying to attract more investment, trying to make it easier, and you're finding that local content requirements are, in many cases, ironically, a constraint to that. How you decide to address that as a government is going to be something really interesting to watch.
That case on the WTO, it's originated by European Union?
European Union and Japan.
Okay. Your turn. Yes. Gotcha.
The people on the webcast want to listen to you.
Question. The past year and a half, 2 years, we've seen great events that have really, changing the country. But it hasn't been a true transformation yet for Brazil, right? We do see society pushing the government to change, the political system to change, but it has not been a true transformation. And it isn't one until you have the right person at the right time, right? So is Brazil approaching that tipping point like we have seen in the past under the military regime, where we thought it would never end until, there was that change and we had the Constitution, which was a great milestone at the time, but it's simply not working anymore for today's society. Are we reaching that tipping point in Brazil socially, politically, economically?
Let me add one point to that question. Try to help the question. No, because it's a very good question, actually. And I have one thought. If this is so blatantly unconstitutional, as some of the justices have said, what would happen if 6 members of the 11 members of Supreme Court, a majority, would decide that this was really unconstitutional, and that therefore we cannot risk throwing the whole thing out because of the reasons you pointed out, but we are the constitutional court of this republic, and we therefore declare that the second vote should be thrown out. Why? Because senators cannot claim that they are ignorant of the law, that they're ignorant of the Constitution. This is no defense. And therefore, there is no recourse. If the Supreme Court decides that, there is no recourse.
There shouldn't have been ever any recourse.
Okay,
The Senate
but
was.
yes, no,
they
but,
were
no,
the
but
judges.
we are in the
Yeah.
current situation, and I'm trying to build on Cassia's very good question, because would this be a tipping point where really the rule of law is real in this country? Is this part of?
I think if there's a tipping point here, and maybe setting you up, but is the pension system. When everybody who's aspired to be a public servant or work for a state-owned company and sort of knew, well, at least that retirement is guaranteed, they're going to start seeing and say, hey, we've invested your money on really bad ideas, and we've stolen some of your money.
You know what he's talking about, right? There is a federal police has just had an operation on the basis of
Operation Greenfield
Operation
against the
Greenfield.
4 major state pension funds in Brazil, and they block like 8 billion
public company.
reais. It's like $2.5 billion, and they froze this money, and they are investigating connections between these public state funds and people that are already under charge in the car wash operation. So we are going really big in terms of investigation. So that's why on the first question, we are talking about the agreement. I think that there is in the Senate this worry of the senators to avoid punishments in Brazil, new punishments in Brazil. And I think that's what's happened in your question and in the Senate vote. And it's clear a tipping point, and I think that we have many, like the pension reforms and our economic situation that I think that Monica can explain for us as well.
Tipping points, Monica.
Tipping points. I like them. They're non-linear. So they're interesting for that fact alone. But I would say this. I'll do the economics tipping point bit in a second. But to marry your question and Paulo's point, I would say that before the impeachment, we were clearly moving, or at least we seemed to be moving towards a tipping point in terms of rule of law, investigations. This was what everybody was watching. Brazilian society in general, the population in general, was glued to the Lava Jato investigations, as attested by Mauricio's surveys and opinion polls and so on. The split vote is actually a kind of a bifurcation scenario, because either we continue moving towards the tipping point which would be Paulo's scenario, where the Supreme Court uses its mandate to as the the beholder of the Constitution and say, look, you cannot trample the Constitution, and thus this is a no. We will nullify the second vote, and then we continue to be moving towards the tipping point. Or we have the other scenario where the Supreme Court decides to shrug it off, in which case we move away from the tipping point and back towards a situation that we would not like to see Brazil in. So I think that, to me, that's more or less where we are right now after this August 31st vote. On the economy, it's a little easier to talk about tipping point on the economy, to be quite frank, because the tipping point really had a name and a surname. She was called Dilma Rousseff, and she tipped the economy into a very bad situation, and she was unable to get it out of that situation. I'm not saying that the current government, we know that the current government has certain problems. However, they seem capable of at least turning the situation around, meaning they seem capable of at least stopping the recession. So at a bare minimum, I would expect this government, even without, a major reform effort, even without being able to get the proper political agreements that they need, even with all the shortcomings, all the caveats that we've highlighted, I expect this government to stop the recession. And I think that's already beyond the tipping point, because you've moved from the inflection point. You've gone from going down to at least stabilizing.
João, are we closer to a tipping point?
In hindsight, you can see some tipping points in Brazilian politics, but the politics of Brazil tends to be more linear, I think. Brazil's political system is so complex that one effect of it is that it tends to channel politics and policy making towards more moderate grounds, right? If you compare with some countries in the region as well, you look at some of our neighbors, the pendulum shifts straight, Argentina, right, from the neoliberal 1990s to the Bolivarian and Kirchnerism of the 2000s. And Brazil is always kind of these dysfunctionalities that we know very well. They're bad, right? They increase the cost of doing business in Brazil. The Brazil cost is there, all the elements of it. But there's a sense that they do also provide buffers to more extreme radical policies as well, right? Talk about the pre-salt, talk about the oil sector. But contracts were respected, right? One-third or two-thirds of the pre-salt has been awarded through the concessions regime, and rules haven't changed there. You can argue that there's some strong army of the private sector, and there is, but the rules remain overall. But so in the if you look at the Independence Day, to make a reference here that Paulo made in the beginning of this, it was a transition. There was no tipping point even there, because the son of the Portuguese emperor remained in Brazil. And even the military dictatorship, it was a very slow negotiated process to the distension and open up the political regime. So now, is it a tipping point? I wouldn't think so, but I don't see that as necessarily bad. I think there's a learning curve, right? With some steps to the backward, I think, as Monica alluded to, when it comes to the economy. But some of the mistakes that were made during the PT's tenure, especially in the last tenure, were started. The limits to it were already there. Even Rousseff herself, she appointed Levy. She could have done worse, right? If we do a counterfactual here, it could have been worse. She acknowledged the need to change rules to the pre-salt, not by conviction, but by necessity, right? So you see, and I think, looking at the politics of Brazil the next 2 years, for a long, long time, we've been focused on the macro economy, the fiscal story, the macro politics, impeachment, election, and I think at least the silver lining is that more and more the microeconomic, sector-specific regulatory agenda will progress, will advance. We'll have some positive changes that were referred to here in the oil sector, the mining sector, changes to regulatory agencies, strengthening of them, environmental licensing. There's a whole huge agenda that you know better than I do, that we think there's going to be a lot of progress. But the question is, how much progress can you have on a micro-regulatory agenda without fixing the fiscal, right? Because who's going to invest in a country that cannot stabilize that GDP ratio, right? And the big players that are supposed to invest in key sectors of the economy, energy and infrastructure, are either under financial distress because they can't go and tap the markets because just the cost is too high, or they're under legal distress for the obvious reasons that were mentioned here. And so in order to attract foreign players, you need to give assurance. and assurance is macroeconomic stability. So there's a line of contact between the macro story, the fiscal story, and the microeconomic and regulatory. So no linear, I think no tipping point, but it's still, there's a learning curve there that I'm positive about.
But to give assurance, wouldn't it be nice that the rule of law is affirmed beyond a reasonable doubt?
But Paul, I mean, let's just remember. I mean, every country does these kinds of things. I mean, we're in a country that had separate but equal for many years. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. I'm not defending what was done in the one by the Supreme Court, but it's like this is not going to destroy the country. We just have to
Hanging
move on.
chads in Florida.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, well, I'm not going to go there.
I want to add about the tipping
There
point.
were consequences. There are lots, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that probably would be alive today.
Maybe,
Yeah.
but life
Paul.
goes on.
About the public opinion, I just want to add something that I figure out working political campaigns. I think the tipping point would be when the leaders start to translate into the people that the party of the Constitution of '98 is over. Because people are demanding better public service, better security, better education, better transport, better mobility, but there is no revenue, there is no money for that. And I don't see the candidates go out there and saying, we have to make tough decisions. We cannot have universal health and pension. And by the time they start doing this, and we are not there, I don't see any major mayor candidate as of today talking the reality that we have to make decisions. And that's the tipping point on the public side opinion, because people are demanding, and the leaders are saying that they're going to give more, but there is no more to give. So that's my.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to underscore, 30 seconds, I'll speak fast. Just to underscore Mauricio's point, the pension reform, for example, is an issue that is going to go to Congress, or at least the government says is going to go to Congress very soon. The population at large has no clue what the pension reform entails. Actually, the population at large in Brazil doesn't even really know how the pension system works. All they know is that they get their benefit when they're entitled to it. And they more or less know what's the rule that governs their entitlement. So if you don't have that kind of discourse, and this is exactly where I agree with Mauricio, if you don't have a government that's actually telling the population what the pension system is and what they're proposing to do about it, how do you expect that pension reform to pass? And I think that tipping point we have certainly not reached.
Well, with that, we have to conclude, but I just wanted to call your attention to something in Folha de São Paulo. I hope to post this. An interview that former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso gave, that is on tape. President Cardoso turned 85 in June, and he is always welcome here because the Brazil Institute was his idea. And he's very influential here also because it was his idea to help put together the Latin American program in the 70s. And he said that the parties, the Workers' Party and his own party that were fundamental to the transformation of Brazil in the 90s and after the reinstatement of democracy in Brazil, have become old parties. And it's very real to say someone that studied Brazil, actually the only leader that probably studied Brazil before governing it, to say that and to remind people that we are exhausted. The political forces in Brazil are spent, and something will have to come to replace that. So, with that little speech, I wanted to thank you very much for coming here, for being with us. Stay tuned. Ambassador Sergio Amaral will be here on the 13th, and we will continue to seek for opportunities to explain what's going on and come back. Thank you.
Got it.